Okay, so look, I'll kick off. My name's Lisa Folkes. I'm the Director of Employment for Social Ventures Australia. I want to start today's webinar by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we meet on. In my case, I'm standing on Wurundjeri land, and I want to pay my respects to the elders of the various lands that you are on today, and we are all on today. Pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you very much for coming along to this discussion about the new Workforce Australia program that will start on 1 July, so very soon. And this is an opportunity to have a conversation with some of Australia's leading experts on employment services. And we're going to have a very open discussion and speculation really about what the new employment services might bring for unemployed people and what sorts of cultural change we may or may not see in the landscape that we're in. It's very speculative, no one knows. 1 July, things will start happening. I should say this isn't designed to be an explainer about the new system. The department and can do some of that, and hopefully there'll be other forums for that. It's more a bit of a chance to think about the system, to discuss its architecture, and to try to think about what its implications may be. The basic format is I'm going to give a brief intro to some of the key changes in the system, just as a bit of background. And then I'm going to bring in our panellists and we're going to have a discussion, talk about some of the key questions that arise. And then we'll also open up for your questions. With your questions, if you can put them in the Q&A section in the panel, and we'll monitor them and we'll come to them once we've had an initial discussion. So please do that, and we really look forward to a bit of interaction. So I'm going to start by giving you a brief overview, and as I said, it's not going to be a full explainer, but I guess this is a bit of an initial perspective on what's changing and some of the things that we might want to be aware of in the new system. Okay, so I'm just going to start that off now, and I will make sure, I'm hoping that people can see it, and that if people can't, that someone will alert me. Okay, so I do also want to acknowledge the support of the Macquarie Group Foundation for SVA's work on employment. They've been very supportive of us trying to think about ideas about employment services system and how it may or may not work for people, particularly in the context of people trying to find quality jobs. Okay, so Workforce Australia, what does it mean? Let me just try to figure out why there we go. Okay, Workforce Australia. So the first thing to say is this is Australia's universal employment service. Everyone who is on unemployment benefits in Australia has to engage on one of the employment services. The first two in this table are the ones that are affected by the Workforce Australia changes. So Job Active had around 850,000 people in it, and Transition to Work, which is a youth specialist service, had around 25,000. And Transition to Work continues through to July, but with different providers. Alongside, there's two other programs that aren't affected by the changes. Disability Employment Services, around over 300,000 people sitting in those services, and CDP, which is the Remote Employment Services. But the ones that we're talking about are Job Active in particular and Transition to Work. So that's almost 900,000 people who are currently engaged with those services. So in 2018, the Commonwealth Government commissioned an independent expert panel to have a look at Job Active as that primary service and to consider what might be done to improve it. And in broad terms, that independent panel identified a number of flaws in the system or deficiencies in the system. First of all, it wasn't achieving enough for the hardest to place, so the proportion of people on the caseload who are long-term unemployed, that is 12 months plus, or very long-term unemployed, that is 2 years plus, was increasing. So if an employment service is meant to give those people more of a chance in the system, it wasn't really delivering that. It was perceived as impersonal. Employers were complaining about the service and saying it was confusing. Many were withdrawing from using the service. And it was seen as insufficiently flexible to adapt to local needs, particular needs of communities, locations. So the Workforce Australia system, which starts on 1st of July, if you look on the blue blocks sort of make up the core of that system. So first of all, there's a set of online services. So people who are newly unemployed, who are not considered to be at risk of long-term unemployment and who are digitally literate will go into an online service initially. So that for at least the first 12 months, the default setting will be that they will engage with online services. And at present, the last statistics I've seen, there are about 190,000 people who were sitting in that service and will be going into that service from 1 July. The next layer, and perhaps the one that we'll talk about the most, is enhanced services. So for people who've been unemployed for over 12 months or who are assessed as being at risk of long-term unemployment, they will go into what you might call a case management service, a one-on-one service. So that they will be in a more flexible arrangement where they will get case management delivery by a provider who are similar to the job active providers, that system that we know of today. So online services, you're not attached to a provider. Enhanced services, you are attached to a provider. And then transition to work, again, case management service for young people, quite similar to how it exists today. And in terms of numbers, at the moment, 590,000 people in enhanced services and around 23,000 in transition to work. So enhanced services are the bulk of the new system. Alongside that, there are a number of other services that sit around it. So they're not the universal services, but they're ancillary services or complementary services. So employment skills training, career transition services for older people, a specific set of services for employers, particularly looking at training for specific industry needs, and the local jobs program, which is across the country is a group of employment facilitators that are there to link the bits of the system together and to link them with other things going in the labour market. So address this issue about tailoring to the labour market. So enhanced services, perhaps the core of the system, arguably. Estimated funding about 1.3 billion per annum. It's the largest procurement outside defence, apparently, to bring on those services. Has individually tailored intensive case management services. The estimate is that around 60% of job seekers will end up in that service or will be in that service. Their job seekers in that service will have 6 monthly activity requirements. So they will have to do some form of, or show that they have done some sort of intensive activity at least every 6 months. Providers are expected to also deliver services to employers, so expected to step up the degree to which they work with employers to help them fill vacancies and screen applicants. The financial modelling has been based on caseloads of about 1 to 80. Now that's significant because the job active system, which was seen as impersonal, not doing enough for the hardest to place, had average caseloads over 150, sometimes 250. So the part of the rationale of this system was to put more people online so that more investment could go into these enhanced services so that caseloads could be reduced. So this is a core feature, a core change that is designed to address that previous failing of the system. There'll be new progress payments, which are which recognise providers' investments in getting people closer to employment. So sort of a step between where they start and where unemployment. And it moves from a contracting system to a panel or licensing system. Essentially, I mean, my take on that is it makes it easier to remove poorer performing providers and to replace them with other providers on the panel. So there's a new performance framework. There's not a lot of detail on that. It replaces the star ratings, but the elements of the performance framework in the new system we know are sustained employment, which looks very familiar. So that has the same emphasis in a sense on 12 and 26-week employment outcomes that exists in the job active system. But alongside that, there will be modules that relate to helping people progress to employment, quality of service to participants and employers, and to licensing standards, so quality of service overall, internal integrity and quality of service. But we don't know a lot about this at this stage. Automation is a key feature of the system. As I said, many people will be in the online platform, but most people will be interacting with the online platform in order to manage their mutual obligation, to report on how they're meeting their obligations. And there'll be a new points-based system for structuring mutual obligation, which I'll just show you a screenshot of to illustrate. But also the compliance system is now increasingly automated. So there's the ability for system-generated suspensions of income support. So automation is a key feature of the system. The rationale is partly to try to reinvest funding in face-to-face services, but there's also an argument that's made that this will enhance individuals' ability to control their own reporting, to take more responsibility for their compliance. As I said, points-based activation, this is the intention, or the stated intention, is to move from a rigid system that says you have to do 20 job searches per month to a system where you have 100 points and you can use a mix of different strategies to make up your 100 points. I put this screenshot up partly because I think it's really complex, and I think the complexity of the system has its own problems. So editorialise there, but this is, and I encourage you to go and look at the videos on points-based activation, because I guess particularly for those of us who are less numerate, less digitally literate, I think there are some real questions about the complexity of trying to manage this model, let alone manage our telephone bills and all of those other complex contracts we enter into. So I am now going to finish there with my little whistle-stop tour and overview of the system, and invite the panellists to turn on their cameras, and I'll introduce them and we can start having a discussion about what this will all mean. So joining me today, I'll just stop sharing here. So joining me today, I really couldn't have asked for a more expert group of people to talk about this. So we've got Matt Little, who is the CEO of COACT. Been there for 15 years. I reckon that must mean at least 20 years in the sector, and the last 9 years as the CEO. COACT is a large not-for-profit provider of employment services, including both Job Active, now to be Workforce Australia, but also disability employment services and a range of other services. Also got Simone Casey. So Simone has worked again in this sector for a very long time, Jobs Australia, did a PhD looking at frontline service delivery in the sector, has worked for Per Capita, and now is a Senior Policy Officer with ACOS and an expert in employment services. And Siobhan O'Sullivan, who is Associate Professor of Social Policy at the University of New South Wales, has had a very long-term research interest in employment services, has written a lot, including, and I'm just going to shamelessly plug, fantastic book, provocatively called Buying and Selling the Poor, which takes you inside the offices of job active providers. So you get a sort of real insight into some of the ways that they operate and why they operate. So there we go. Not that we accept sponsorship here, but it's I really highly recommend it. It's actually a really great read. So I'm just going to open up just to talk about what we're leaving behind. So I've mentioned a couple of the implied criticisms of JobActive in the expert panel report, but I guess I wanted to get some reflections from each of you on why the current system, why the JobActive system had to change. And I'm going to start with you, Simone, and perhaps get your some thoughts from you about what were the things that really needed to change in the JobActive system.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Look, I think it's a great question. I could probably speak all day about this, so I'll try and keep it fairly succinct. So from my point of view of having worked at a peak body for employment services, I think there's sort of two sets of issues, and one of them is around the sort of set of complex rules that they're required to administer and through the contract, and the very sort of specific nature of those rules that really kind of create constraints on their practices as employment services organisations. And that's kind of also impacted on the capability of the workforce, where there's been quite low remuneration for quite complex and demanding work. And so, to flip that over, I suppose, from the perspective of people who use employment services, I've kind of engaged on both sides of the coin, really, and I've seen just so much kind of people feeling like the system is punishing them, that the providers are profiting from them, that there's no reciprocity in the idea of mutual obligation, that they're required to do things that are not helpful, but they don't get anything back in return. And I think it's a complex bundle of the interplay of these kinds of things that have created the system that we're hopefully leaving behind.
Yeah, thanks. Matt, what about your reflections? What do we need to change?
Yeah, I think Simone identifies a couple of really interesting points, and I'd agree. I think, as a provider, you're in an incredibly challenging environment, and having travelled around a whole range of our sites around the country, there are genuinely really good people in these services delivering very complex, very prescribed services that really, I think, take away the ability to innovate and differentiate yourself from other services. And I think it's not by accident that caseloads are so consistently high, and the criticism of being impersonal. I think it's it's when all providers are in the same boat. When you break down the requirements that you have to do to meet your contractual obligations, and then apply the funding mechanism over the top of that, it always comes out the same. And I'm not comparing it to aged care, but in a way, there's a structural thing that means this is actually what's left, and you get down to the structural and funding problems. And as I said, the people genuinely in there are, I see people who actually get a great buzz from making a difference to people's lives, but they're constrained of how they can do that, and the innovation differentiation falls out. And I think, that's what I'm excited about leaving behind.
Mm. And Siobhan, some of your research has identified just that, hasn't it? That convergence. Yeah, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, and thank you to everyone who's joining us. So a little peek behind the curtain. I knew that this question was coming up, so I've come up with a little list of issues that I think would be very good if we could move beyond. I must say, I'm not completely convinced that the new system will be able to address all of these, but I'll just flag the issues, and then we can come back and discuss whatever we want in more detail. So I think, as probably most people would agree, or perhaps might agree, the current system isn't good at helping highly vulnerable people, so people with a lot of barriers to employment, and people who would require a great deal of investment to get them into employment. And I think a lot of these issues are interlinked. So part of the problem with a long-term investment in people who have a great distance to the labour market has to do with the nature of the contracting system. And so if you're a provider and you're thinking rationally, you might think to yourself, well, these particular people are going to require a great deal of long-term investment to get them into work. And chances are we won't be actually providing the service at the time they are ready to enter into work. So these kind of even an 18-month contract probably isn't enough to invest in someone who's highly vulnerable. It's not clear that the systems always do a good job at getting the money to the job seekers. So, of course, trying to design the contracts so the providers actually are necessarily investing in the job seekers, that's clearly very tricky. And I wouldn't be the one I would not want to be the one designing the contracts, because I can imagine how many tensions that would create. I think also the current system, third sector or charitable organisations aren't able to demonstrate how much they give back to the community. That's not something that you can write into your procurement documents. And I think that's a real missed opportunity, because there are great third sector organisations that are doing so much for the community. The current system also, I don't think, is terribly good at providing career progression for frontline staff. And so giving them opportunity and allowing them to perhaps earn the income that they deserve for the work they do, and also have a career progression, I think that's also an issue. And of course, this brings us to the issue of gender. So the system is very gendered. Most of the people who deliver the service at the front line will be women. And often, in my view, they're not remunerated in a way that really reflects the quality of work they're doing. But our research has also uncovered that the system can be quite gendered in how it deals with job seekers. And so there's a tendency to send men to one type of job and women to another. And so, you know, if we could somehow address that, I think it would be absolutely fantastic. And of course, as other people have already said, the current system is highly prescriptive.
Thanks so much. I think you've covered some of this, but I was going to ask you a little bit about provider behaviour. I mean, your book that we've talked about, it really looks at what were identified as high-performing sites, and I guess really interested that, you know, providers are often presented as bad actors in this space. Now, I don't think anyone's done that today. Actually, you know, we've talked about the structures, but I guess I'm really interested from your reflections of those high-performing sites. First of all, you know, were there any surprises in that work? And did you have a sense of what drove the behaviour on the ground, like that frontline interaction?
Yeah, so for people who haven't had the chance to read our book, we got data from the department, which we were very grateful for, that showed us which officers within agencies were doing a really good job with the most highly vulnerable, so the stream C. And we then we were given a long list, and we chose 4 agencies, quite diverse. And we went and spent multiple days at the front line observing their every interaction. And what we were trying to do was find out if we could identify why, within a system that overall isn't particularly great with highly vulnerable job seekers, why some officers within some agencies were able to do a good job. And what we found actually was that there is not one single secret herbs and spice. So there's not one thing that we can share with you that would do a good job particularly. But some of the things that we did observe was, first of all, you don't need to actually place many long-term unemployed people into a sustained job to be considered a high-performing agency. And so, for example, one of the things we discovered as part of the research was that actually 4 placements of people who are long-term unemployed into a sustained job is enough to have you classified as a high-performing agency. So it's a system that isn't giving us high returns for a lot of investment. And the other thing that we observed was that, so very, very small number of people need to be placed into work. And then we saw a range of other things. We saw some agencies that really focused in on the kind of the stick part of the carrot and the stick kind of equation. And so there was a lot of PRing people, reporting them for minor violations. We also observed quite a bit of work trying to get job seekers moved out of the system. So if they weren't perceived as really wanting a job, there was effort putting into either streaming them, so having them classified in a higher category, or indeed moved out of the system. But at the same time, we also saw beautiful frontline staff, very, very committed, working extremely hard to do what they could for job seekers. We saw agencies where the frontline staff were extremely valued members of the system. They were, also the local footy coach, and also the person that runs the local, rehab centre or whatever else. So we saw a range of things, but unfortunately, not one single thing that we can say necessarily works. Some agencies being hard on PRing worked, and others being very community-minded work. So there are a range of ways to get to be a high-performing agency. But one consistency we did note across all 4 sites was that they had smallish caseloads. So having a very, very big caseload seems to make it harder for you to be regarded as a high-performing state. So this brings us back to, I guess, the issue of KPIs and what happens when agencies focus on meeting the department's requirements that perhaps are not always consistent with advancing the interests of their client job seekers.
And so, Siobhan, by that you mean the sites themselves had a small caseload?
Yes, the sites themselves, the actual offices. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that is very apparent when you're in the system, but maybe not so much from outside, is the extent to which it's a numbers game. There's a numerator and denominator, and you can either move one or the other, or both, or try to act on both. So, there is a sort of basic maths at play here. So, Matt, look, I want to sort of start talking about the new system, and you are in the middle of implementation. You're ready to roll on 1 July, no doubt. I guess for you, in terms of thinking about the network, and I should say COACT has a very innovative model of collaborative work. So it works between the national office and its local partners. So it's a very, very interesting model for those who want to think more about it. But I guess for you, in thinking about the transformation from the former system to the new system, what are the key changes that you're trying to manage? What is going on for you guys?
Yeah, look, if I was to summarise it, I'd put it to 2 just for this session, Lisa. We did a lot of preparation, thinking about the future and the changes of what we'd like to see in a future model, and we're really surprised and excited about some of the changes that were presented through the workshops and the original model. I'd say, first of all, change is the biggest challenge. So going out, seeing our network, and actually a bit the same as Siobhan, going into the site and talking to the individuals, and you start talking about this massive caseload change, this massive ability to now be targeted, individualised, really, intensive case management, so to speak. But you've got staff that have done 9-10 years of high volume transaction, and that change, I don't think will happen by default. It'll actually take leadership at the organisational level, and importantly at the site level, to empower that change and to give permission to that change. And I think that was probably one of our key findings early in the piece, preparing for the new bid. And I think out of that, certainly from a COACT perspective, another big theme through the I Want to Work and the workshop was around professionalism of workforce. And so we've put a lot of time and effort into thinking about, how do we do, we call it the COACT Academy, but how do we train our workforce consistently to embrace this change and to understand that it's a whole new way. It's not Job Active 2.0. It's a totally different business. And probably just a quick reflection on Siobhan's sort of findings as well. probably my perception or reflection over, many years in the industry is you can often, I feel like I can walk into a site and go, wow, this is a good site, or wow, this is not, this needs improvement pretty quickly. But I'd say for me, the real commonality of high performance is the leader. And it's about the culture of the organisation and what's acceptable in terms of behaviour and engagement and motivation. And even at an organisation level, it's hard to get that consistently across the organisation. It's a very localised, specific thing. And so part of our strategy and our response is about investing in the leaders and driving that culture right across all of our leaders of the network, and building an alumni almost of leaders, or a network where we can get better, get momentum on top of ourselves and build greater expertise. So, yeah.
So I guess, again, to you, Matt, one of the central promises of this new system, of the enhanced services piece of the new system, is that it will deliver more personalised support, smaller caseloads. And I guess all of us have been around the sector for a long time. We've actually heard that before, right? It'll be more personalised, work better for the long-term unemployed. So how likely do you think that's going to be realised in this iteration of employment services?
Yeah, so look, I think the funding model by design, and the opening comment I made, now when you do those numbers, you look at the requirements and you look at the funding, absolutely, our caseloads, I think you had a figure there about 80 to 1 was in the modelling, we're down around the 70 to 1. COACT also for 9 or 10 years or more, longer, Lisa, as you know, has done an intensive case management pilot or a delivery that's really acted against the grain. So has said, even where everyone's doing caseloads of 151, we can actually do this with 51. But it takes a leap of faith, and the results, the revenue lag 6 months behind. So you got to trust in the process and trust in the results, and that's often hard to do. And in where you have sites that have lots of staff with very big caseloads, having one person over there with 50, there's a lot of jealousy in the site very quickly about why I want their job, why can't I have their job? And I think now we've got an environment where everyone's going to have that in dynamic. What I'd say over that history of seeing that intensive case management, there are people that are great at that, and there are people, like any business, there will be really stars at this targeted, individualised approach, and there'll be people that'll struggle to deliver, they'll still want to try and deliver a one-size-fits-all type of approach. And I think as organisation leaders, that's our challenge to, empower those people to think about it. But I do think the model certainly will do that. But I more than anything else, I think what the system promises is, I think there will be real differentiation between providers this time around. I think there is the much more scope for innovation. There is much more scope for less prescription. And I think all providers who were successful have bid, and the department's chosen, obviously, who the providers would be. But their service models, I suspect, will be very different as a result of this greater flexibility. And so I think in a lot of ways it gives the job seekers, the participant, much greater option of exercising choice. And I think that's, it's certainly something that we're very conscious of, and I think will be a very different part in this new model. I think we'll see more choice exercised because I think there'll be a great difference between providers.
Yeah, look, I'll be interested. I'll get others to comment on that as well, because I suppose, again, I would say, and I know that that those things have been promised before, and what we've tended to see is a bit of a pattern of let's go for innovation, let's open things up, and then at some point things get closed back down again. So look, that I'll rather than me bang on about my special subject, I'm interested, Simone, in getting your sense of I know that ACOS certainly welcomed the promise of greater investment in the long-term unemployed, and there have been some things that have been supported about the model, but very interested in your sense of, or ACOS's sense of, where the risks and opportunities sit in this new model.
Yeah, look, I'll start with opportunities actually, because I don't want to start off on the negative foot. So, look, I think it's great that the aspiration is to have a more flexible and personalised service. And, when I've looked at the estimates and seen things like a unit cost per participant of something around the $5,000 figure, that's kind of filled me with a bit more confidence that, maybe now the resources will be distributed in the ways that people who are vulnerable, as Siobhan has mentioned, actually need it, that longer term investment, and that kind of very flexible investment. I think it's quite right to reinvest savings made from the online employment services into the people who need it, and more or less to leave the people who don't need employment services in their face alone. So all of those things do make quite a lot of sense to me. I guess the things that I would remain a little bit concerned about, and which ACOS has published in various submissions along the way as the model has developed, is some of the kind of reproduction of some of the inflexibilities around the activities. So although it's a vast improvement that the 6 monthly activity requirement is now only for 2 months rather than 6 months, which I think to some people probably felt like a jail sentence. It's still there, the 6 months. You have to do this at 6 months. And if you haven't found something else to do, then we're going to shove you into work for the dole or EST. So I still feel like we haven't kind of moved far enough away from that mindset of, we must have these activities for people at certain intervals. And I know it's possible for providers to get people into activities at different times, but I think the specificity of the requirement that something happens at a certain date informs a mindset, as it has with the AAR and the work for dole. Like, it's like, right, we're gearing up now to get you into this, right? Instead of, oh, it would have been, maybe you should have done work experience or whatever a little bit earlier on. So that, I guess, is a concern. I think the main thing that, I would really focus on now is the workforce, as Matt's mentioned, like the opportunity to retrain the workforce and to change the culture of the organisations. And I really hope, more than anything, that is what we're going to see. But just to kind of dampen that, I suppose, a little bit is, when I've been looking at the job ads that are around for some of the providers who are expanding quite significantly and looking at the skill set that they're recruiting for, I'm like, oh, I'm not quite sure if that change is actually coming into the workforce. So yeah, anyway, that's my those are my thoughts at this point in time. But I do think, fantastic opportunity for there to be real, genuine, fundamental change. And I'm hoping that the conditions that have been set up for the providers enable that. I find it really heartwarming to hear from Matt, who's actually, going through the experience of transformation in his own organisation. Because our outside speculators don't actually really get to hear that often. So I'm pleased to hear all of that.
So I'm going to throw to Siobhan, but I'll just say, if anyone's got questions, please put them in the Q&A box, because I've got one other question after this, but then really want to hear from you and any thoughts and questions you might have. So Siobhan, I think Simone's, highlighted this sort of very transactional nature of that you sort of fall into this very transactional system, and there's almost a temptation, or maybe there's some drivers to fall into that. What are your reflections on the risks and opportunities that we might face, or what might happen?
Well, it's interesting. So in thinking about this issue, I call on both the history of our system in Australia and some of the research that my research team has done comparing the Australian system to the UK. And so what we find historically with the Australian system, going back to the Keating era really, and then accelerating from that point forward, is that there have been repeated, and I think perhaps at the time of design, sincere desires to make the system diverse and innovative and responsive and all those things that lie at the heart of why the system was privatised in the first place. But then, of course, the department feels the need to re-regulate. And so the rules are brought in and the kind of their application is holus bolus. So you have one agency does something and then everyone is required to behave in a particular way. And what that does is it does create standardization in the system. And it brings us back to this research puzzle that's kind of been at the heart of our research for many decades now, which is why privatize a system if you're then going to get everyone to behave in exactly the same way? Now, I have seen previously, as I know probably everyone presenting today has, I've seen multiple attempts to break out of that, but it always comes back to it. So what we're going to see, I think, is we're going to discover whether actually the department, the purchaser, is path dependent or whether they can break with that path dependency. So I think only time will tell. But one kind of green shoot that I think we can be a little bit optimistic about is that the UK system is not as standardised as the Australian system. It is not as red tape laden, and it does allow for more innovation. And whenever we've looked at the UK, we do a survey of frontline employment services staff reasonably regularly, kind of every 5 years, and we compare the Australian response to the UK response. And we always find more diversity in the UK system compared to Australia. And in trying to puzzle out why this would be, one of the things that we've hypothesised is that in the UK system, they have retained their public provider who is at the centre of the system, and the private agencies, the contracted agencies, are kind of providing extra auxiliary services. And we've hypothesised that perhaps that allows for a little bit of diversity and innovation in the system. So the core is with the public provider, and the private providers therefore perhaps feel a little bit more at liberty to innovate. Well, in some strange way, the Australian system is becoming a little bit like that, right? We've renationalised the core services, and the enhanced services are with the private providers. So perhaps in Australia now, we are going to get kind of a sense that, right, the core business is being done by the government. Now we can innovate. And if that happens, then we could see exciting diversity. But I'm a little bit sceptical. I have to wait to see what happens.
Yeah, fascinating. Yes, it's sort of not called renationalising, but the creation of a digital government-run digital service is absolutely that. So very, very interesting. Look, I've got a few questions in here and I'll come to them, but I would say that this isn't an explainer about the new system. So I'm not going to promise that we're going to answer sort of technical questions about how the system operates. We're more trying to think about how the shape, what it might feel like, what it might look like. But I want to just ask one more question from me before we go to some of those questions from the audience. And I guess, you know, one of the issues that I find really interesting is that we all know that the workforce is getting more skilled, that we desperately need more skilled labour. Everyone says it. In DESI, you've got this bit of the organisation that focuses on skills development, how we're going to get these high-level jobs, people with skill. It's not just about training, it's about experience, like building on the job experience. And yet we have a system, and it seems to still be the case for this, but I'm going to get your reflections on it, which says, well, any job's a good job. So you might have an IT qualification, but if a job comes up in picking and packing, we're going to put you in there. So that any job is a good job. Do you think that there is any sign or promise that this system will be any better at equipping people for an increasingly skilled, increasingly transforming labour market? And I guess I'll start with you, Simone, and then I'll ask Matt for some thoughts.
I think it's a really interesting question, and probably should have gone to Siobhan first because I'm going to talk about price signalling. And so what that means is that sometimes provider behaviour is kind of focused on getting the money, right? And so if the money is available through them getting the work first jobs, any job, then they may well do that. Now, look, I think it's all a bit more complicated than that, because we are talking about people who have been unemployed for, like, you know, at least 12 months, generally in the enhanced services. So, you know, most people are just going to, you know, if there's a work available and it's easy for them to get it, they will probably be getting it already. So I think, you know, pushing people into jobs that are not sustainable is not going to last. It's not going to lead to an outcome. So from a provider point of view, they'd be, you know, rationalising the best way to go about this. And so I think it's fair for me to stop there, and then because I'm sure Matt would like to comment on that.
Yeah, either Matt or Siobhan.
After you, Siobhan.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Look, I do think that there is still a relatively short contract for for providers, considered in relation to the types of barriers that job seekers might have. So one of our views is that if you want to invest long-term in people who have a lot of barriers to employment, you need long contracts. And the kind of the review period, you know, the 18 months, to me, that is not a long contract. That is not going to give a provider confidence that someone who is, you know, illiterate, has significant mental health issues, perhaps homelessness, drug issues, to deal with that kind of long-term, to deal with the kind of thing that would require long-term investment is still going to be a challenge in any system that is rather short contracts. And also, I think quite fairly from the provider's perspective, where the threat is that your contract will be taken from you, they need to think about not only the job seekers, but indeed their staff. They don't want their staff to become job seekers themselves. And so doing what it takes to retain the contract becomes a priority, and it's not a criticism at all. I understand it entirely why that would be the case. It's a design issue, but then how you design it in a way that doesn't incite that behaviour is very tricky itself, complicated.
Yeah, look, I'd agree very much. I think, you know, there's a lot at risk for providers in getting leases and doing all these sort of things. And if you don't get a quick start in these arrangements, you could very easily find yourself, you know, being exposed to some of those liabilities. You know, I am hopeful that there is the way the outcome or the revenue flows, there is a lot of revenue at risk of sustained employment. And I am hopeful through this new design that people will actually see there's a lot of wasted effort in putting people in the wrong job that won't actually get through the 26-week. And it's much more, you know, much more commercial now in thinking about how do we spend the right time at understanding what their needs are, getting the right job, and lifting that conversion at 26 weeks significantly. That's, to me, that's the end game. That's the win-win. I'd counter that by saying I always thought the missed opportunity with this bid, and I'd advocated it quite significantly, you know, to our contract managers and so forth, and opportunities was, you know, the TTW, the design of the TTW program was very much more at the front end, an investment to work very intensively with, you know, the disengaged youth, and it's delivered fantastic results, you know, a step change from the mainstream. And so that program's going great. And then we do a totally different structure in this program over here. And for me, that was always the missed opportunity. But it probably also leads to the counter risk that if you pay it all up front with not much at risk, there could be more parking risk there as well. So it's always about balance. And I think it's about, it comes back to me around the ethos of the provider and why are they here and what are they trying to achieve. And yeah, so I think the quality, the job quality will come down to very much around how people's service models have been designed, and are we here to understand the individual needs of this job seeker in front of us, and we're going to commit the time to actually get to the right job.
Yeah, and look, and I suppose what I would also reflect on is that's also about the performance framework and how what weighting is put on speed to place, because inevitably if it's about quick placement, then it is the first available job as opposed to waiting another 3 months before the apprenticeship comes up, whatever. So look, audience questions. So I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a couple of questions and I'm going to get you guys to jump in. So two questions. First one, social enterprise, clearly provides, there's a lot of evidence that it can provide a pathway for long-term unemployed people, but social enterprises have been very frustrated with trying to deal with the previous, the job active system. Is there an opportunity for social enterprises in this new model?
I'm trying to understand, so the social enterprise in terms of getting workers from the job active or the Workforce Australia, is that the perspective?
Yes, I guess, is there more opportunity for collaboration? So, getting referrals, presumably maybe getting some investment, by those employment service providers in providing training or placement opportunities for those in those social enterprises.
Yeah, look, I think, so the new progress payments in this design of the model, and, without understanding the specifics of this example, I think there is more incentive for providers to do work at the front end to increase the workability or the work capacity of the job seeker. And I think if the social enterprise type arrangement satisfies those requirements, then yeah, I think there's a whole new incentive or revenue stream around progress and what is progress, and providers will need to ascertain what's the progress intervention that this person needs to move them closer to sustained employment. And I think social enterprise could play a great role there.
I suppose there are a couple of other questions that go to this question of local collaboration. To what extent is there going to be an appetite, or will this new system encourage greater collaboration around local issues with local providers? There's one question here about all of my contacts in Job Active have lost their contracts. How should I engage with this new system? So any thoughts on this collaboration, and how should these, whether they're social enterprises or NGOs, try to engage in this system?
Lisa, I might just jump in if that's okay. I just wanted to sort of talk about local jobs program a little bit. And so I'm of the view that we've kind of set up the architecture for there to be this local jobs framework, but we actually need to invest a lot more in that and to look at the ways that the Workforce Australia providers can really work in partnership with the local jobs infrastructure, and that would mean getting the funding down to the social enterprises or to the community organisation that wants to do something and give people work experience. So I think there's an opportunity there to kind of create a higher level of integration between the local jobs program and Workforce Australia. But there would probably need to be a bit of a redistribution of funding so that more money was available down to more activities, at the local level as well, and that those activities are sort of, community planned, community driven. They're all grown organically from the ground up. They're not imposed down on those communities. So, so I'm hoping that might be something that happens in the future in terms of the two programs sitting side by side.
Others want to comment on this? There's another question here about the adequacy of the investment and whether that's enough to address the sorts of wraparound supports people might need, particularly the highly disadvantaged. What would you say about funding adequacy at this stage? I mean, Matt, do you want to comment on that?
Look, I think it's, certainly from our perspective, it's much more generous, which has allowed for a much more intensive model. And I look at it as in any sort of, people will put the commercial lens over them. And even in any business, you'll have one person who thinks about it in terms of, well, we need to sort of shave our costs to deliver this result. And, there's trimmers, and there's people who invest in better performance and in growth. And I think that will still happen. you'll still have people take a different approach to this funding model and how we could make more money if we had larger caseloads, or we could. And from my perspective, it's we are here, we exist to get as many people as possible into sustained employment, and so we've taken very much that intensive approach. And I think it is there. I think it's how do you wisely use the employment fund to help support that, and that goes to the wraparound services. You're not trying to do it all internal spend and keep it all yourself. It's actually about how do you connect with the network to deliver, with the community to deliver the best results you can for the person who's in front of you right now. And so to me, it constantly keeps going back to, it's not a one size fits all. What we have here is a very intensive, the opportunity we have here is to deliver a very intensive, targeted, but it'll take us to change to embrace that.
And it sounds from what you're saying earlier too, the progress payments may be a little bit of an important factor in that, because you might invest because you can see that even if you don't get the job outcome, you'll get a progress payment and then eventually maybe get a job outcome. So I think that's a very interesting tweak in the system, probably a good one for people, external organisations to understand. Had a couple of questions in here about mutual obligation and the extent to which that shapes the system, particularly in its automated form. How much is that going to drive the interaction between employment service providers in enhanced services and their clients? Is it going to be harmful, or is it helpful?
There's a favourite line of mine from a Senate inquiry a few years ago. I think Renee Lowry said it, where it's really hard to offer a hand up with the same hand you're smacking them down. And I think it's up to providers to have a level of sophistication in the application of mutual obligation. I do actually think there's greater discretion in this new model for providers to actually take the time to think about what would drive the best response, positive response from the people that they have in front of them. And, more often than not, it's probably not a big stick. And so how do you actually talk? How do you build a trust relationship with someone to say, I'm here to support you and I believe in that we can get somewhere, and then next minute you're hitting them with a breach or something. I think we will have the time and for us to build those trust relationships and try and get a more positive behavioural change, I suppose, is what you're looking to do.
I'm just going to say I'm going to go 5 minutes over it, partly because we've got so many questions and they've all come in at the end. But I suppose the question to Matt around that is, to the extent that the system is automated, people's income can be suspended automatically. Doesn't that disrupt that trusting relationship? You're still going to be tarred with that brush, right? When people's income is suspended.
I'm not into the detail of the application of the point system. And my gut feel would be that will be majoritarily applied to the digital services, but like the more work-ready people that are self-employed, rather than the more case-managed side of the business. And so I think that's, my assumption is that automation is more over here than here.
And Simone or Siobhan, do you want to talk about the role of the stick in the system?
Yeah, I'd happily jump in. Sorry, Siobhan. It won't take long. Look, I think the automation's been with us for a while now. So let's not forget that we've been doing things online for some time. We've had the targeted compliance framework. We've had the Job Seeker app. We've also had the Centrelink app where people have to do their fortnightly reporting. So we haven't just suddenly hit this kind of digital transition. What we're replacing now is the job search reporting requirement with the points-based system, which is just a different system with a different combination of factors that people have to kind of account for in terms of showing that they've met their mutual obligation requirements for a month. Again, for us at ACOS, it comes back to there being sort of like a little bit of inflexibility about what the actual mutual obligation requirements are themselves. In terms of the PBAS, where we don't know yet for sure how onerous the actual reporting of the detail of all the points might be. It will apply to, I'd say, about 95% of people who are in the employment services system, not DES, by the way, but just, like everybody has to do points-based, whether they're in face-to-face services or not. So yeah, look, I think there's two separate questions there. The automation and automatic payment suspensions have already been around. And yes, I think they tar the relationship, they tar the trust that's needed to have good relationships with providers. They are a significant cause of people's disillusion with employment services. It's the message, my payment's suspended again, like, they didn't notify me about the appointment, whatever. It's this sort of cycle. So at ACOS, we're really concerned about payment suspensions happening automatically, and that will happen in PBAS, but probably only to the same extent it does with the job searches once people get used to doing PBASs. But there are over 200,000 payment suspensions every month in Job Active at the moment, and it's quite likely that will continue under the points-based system.
Siobhan, did you want to comment on this issue?
Yeah, I'll just briefly point to an issue that perhaps hasn't been highlighted hugely just yet, and that is the ability of the job seeker to exercise their liberty that comes with the mutual obligation system. So it seems to me that mutual obligation has tended to weigh much more heavily on the job, or the job seeker has not typically taken advantage of their ability to make choices about who they want to receive their service from and that kind of thing. And so I'll be very interested to see whether this system empowers job seekers more from their side of the mutual obligation equation. In some ways, it would be delightful to see job seekers taking an interest in who their provider is and making informed decisions about who they want to receive their service from. In previous iterations, we haven't seen job seekers taking up that opportunity. I do feel very buoyed when I hear that this system will allow for some diversity among providers, and with that may come things such as job seekers being purposeful in their selection of their provider. But then I hear things such as, the provider's name has to be so tiny, you need a magnifying glass to know who they are. And I think, I don't know if the department has learned all its lessons just yet. So if you can work out who's who among the providers, perhaps job seekers will exercise their rights, but we've got to wait and see.
Mm. I guess I'm getting final quick question before we wrap up. Matt, are there any lessons then around this issue of choice, job seeker choice, that we can learn maybe from DES, or any reflections from you about how real is this choice going to be? How well informed will people be when they exercise it?
Yeah, and again, I probably think it's up to us to articulate that. You put up a performance framework at the start, I think, Lisa, and the 5 pillars of that. One of them's around participant satisfaction, so to speak. But that's measured by a destination survey, I think, by the department some time away. I think the open markets of DES really made providers stop and think about the interactions they have with job seekers and how they make that a valuable interaction for the job seeker. And I know certainly from a COAC perspective, we introduced NPS at that stage, and really that was around real-time feedback, right down to the consultant level about the interaction that happened yesterday and whether they saw that as highly valued or not, and that information flowing right across our network. And what we've seen both in DES when we did it in 2018 and in Job Active, I think in about 2020, late 20, is a consistent improvement in that NPS over time. So if you focus your effort there and it's real time and you can learn from it straight away, not 2 years down the track when the survey is done, I think you can actually empower change very quickly. And so my perspective of a performance framework would be, we talk about the government being less prescriptive, would be that, a provider actually has real-time feedback systems in place and they can demonstrate that they act on it. For me, that would be a great system that allows innovation and providers to be different without overly prescribing how it's done. So I think there's still opportunity, and you know, we said in the past, things often start this way and then negatively get impacted. It'd be great if we start this way and then positively get impacted about how we improve the system over time.
And I think, yeah, to Siobhan's point, you know, this is around the purchaser as much as anything else. You know, how much is their culture going to support and be an enabling culture for a more innovative, more responsive network of providers? Look, gone over time. Thank you so much to panellists. Thank you for people asking questions. They all sort of came in a rush and we didn't get to them all, but I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with each of you about what this new system might mean, and I guess wish you luck, Matt, in COACT's attempt to make this the sort of fantastic, you know, deliver on the promises. And yes, and look, thank you very much for coming along and for your patience with the webinar. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
See
you,
you.
Lisa. Thanks, Siobhan.
Bye.